All right, we're now talking about the diencephalon for the brain and cranial nerves chapter for chapter 13 here. And we're talking about, or what you should be able to discern from this section, I should say, is to list the components located in the hypothalamus and describe their functions, explain how circadian rhythm is regulated, discuss the action of the thalamus on sensory information, and describe 7 functions of the hypothalamus. So diencephalon or diencephalon includes the hypothalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. So here we have the corpus callosum, our septum pellucidum. We have our interthalamic adhesion, which is here. We have our anterior commissure, our hypothalamus, our frontal lobe. We have our mammillary body here, our optic chiasm, our infundibulum, which is actually here, and our pituitary gland. And then we have our diencephalon here, this whole section here. And we have the fornix, the choroid plexus in the third ventricle, our thalamus, our habenular nucleus, our pineal gland, our posterior commissure, our tectal plate of the midbrain, our cerebral aqueduct, our cerebellum here, the pons, and our fourth ventricle, all from the mid-sagittal section cut for our diencephalon. The hypothalamus it forms the posterior part of the roof of the diencephalon and covers the third ventricle. It includes a pineal gland, which is the endocrine gland secreting melatonin, helping us with sleep. Helps regulate day-night cycles, circadian rhythms. Our habenular nuclei helps relay signals from the limbic system to the midbrain. It is involved in visceral and emotional responses to odors. Our thalamus is like our operator or our air traffic control center. They're the oval masses of the gray matter on the lateral sides of the third ventricle. Interthalamic adhesion is the midline mass, the gray matter connecting the left and the right thalamus. It's composed of about a dozen thalamic nuclei for the thalamus. The axons from a given nucleus project to a particular region of the cortex. The thalamus receives signals from all conscious senses except olfaction, except for the smell there. It relays some signals to appropriate part of the cortex and filters out other signals distracting from the subject of attention, like background noise in a crowded room. So here are thalamus. The location of the thalamus within the brain right there in the central area there. And you're not going to have to know this specifically for the exam. I'll tell you that there. This is the medial group and the interthalamic adhesion. This is the lateral group here. As far as the ventral group, we have our ventral anterior nucleus, ventral lateral nucleus, the ventral posterior nucleus. That's part of the anterior group over here. And then we have our posterior group, the pulvinar nucleus and the lateral geniculate of the nucleus. The hypothalamus is the anterior-inferior region of the diencephalon. The infundibulum is the stalk of the pituitary that extends from the hypothalamus. The functions of the hypothalamus are control of autonomic nervous system, remember our subconscious or unconscious control, we should say, influences our heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, and respiration. The control of the endocrine system, which secretes hormones that control activities in the anterior pituitary gland, produces the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And the regulation of body temperature. Neurons in the preoptic area detect altered temperature and signal other hypothalamic nuclei to heat or cool the body. For the hypothalamus, food intake, the ventromedial nucleus monitors nutrient levels and regulates hunger. Water intake, anterior nucleus monitors the concentration of dissolved substances in blood and regulates thirst. Our sleep-wake rhythms, the suprachiasmatic nucleus directs the pineal gland to secrete melatonin and regulates circadian rhythms. Emotional behavior is a part of the limbic system, controls emotional responses, pleasure, fear, etc. So looking at our hypothalamus here, located here, we have our paraventricular nucleus and our preoptic area, the anterior nucleus, our supraoptic nucleus, our suprachiasmatic nucleus. We have our optic chiasm here. And we have our dorsal medial nucleus, our posterior nucleus, mammillary body, ventral medial nucleus, our cuate nucleus, and infundibulum. And then we have our posterior pituitary and our anterior pituitary, part of the pituitary gland. So what did you learn? What are the locations and function what is the location and function of the pineal gland, as opposed to what are? What is the general function of the thalamus? And how does the hypothalamus control our feelings of hunger and thirst? So section 13.5, brainstem. List the major features of the midbrain. You should be able to identify the locations and functions of structures that are visible in a cross-sectional view of the midbrain. Explain the involuntary actions produced by the superior and inferior colliculi of the tactile plate. Identify the respiratory center located in the pons. You should also be able to identify the actions of the superior olivary complex. Describe the main features of the medulla oblongata. And list the autonomic centers of the medulla and the functions of each. So the brainstem connects our cerebrum, our diencephalon, and our cerebellum to the spinal cord. It contains ascending and descending tracts. And we'll come back to talk more about those tracts here shortly. We mentioned them briefly already a couple times. It contains our autonomic nuclei, the nuclei of the cranial nerves and the reflex centers. It consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So brainstem. We have here our brainstem here. We have our interthalamic adhesion in between here, our thalamus, our optic chiasm here, and our infundibulum here, our cerebral peduncle here, our part of our midbrain all here, our mammillary bodies on either side here, and our optic tract here or here. We have our cranial nerves, the same on either side here, obviously. The cranial nerves protruding here, part of the pons. Then we have our pyramids here, part of the medulla oblongata, an olive here on either side, and just decussation or decussation of the pyramids here. And of course, that's all part of the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, part of the brainstem here, and the thalamus and infundibulum, part of that, as well as the interthalamic adhesion optic chiasm, are all part of that diencephalon and the cerebral peduncle. Actually, it all kind of crosses the both of them here, more toward midbrain for cerebral peduncle. For the posterolateral view, I won't zoom in this time here, but the diencephalon with the thalamus here, the pineal gland, look here from the posterolateral view, and the optic tract behind. And for the midbrain, we have our tactile plate, which includes our superior colliculi and our inferior colliculi and the cerebral peduncle. And then our pons, we have our superior cerebral peduncle, our middle cerebellar peduncle, and then we have our inferior cerebellar peduncle. And then we have our fourth ventricle. And then we have, going into our medulla oblongata, we have our olive, our nucleus cuneatus, and our nucleus gracilis here. For our components of our midbrain, cerebral peduncles are the motor tracts, the pyramidal system on the anterolateral surface of the midbrain. They carry voluntary motor commands from the primary motor cortex. Our superior cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum to the midbrain. The medial lemniscus, bands of ascending myelinated axons that run through the brainstem. Our substantia nigra is a cluster of cells with black appearance due to melanin, and houses the neurons producing dopamine, which is involved in movement, emotions, pleasure, and pain response. And its degeneration of the substantia nigra causes Parkinson's disease. For the midbrain, also, the tegmentum is involved in postural motor control. It contains our red nuclei. It's pigmented and in our reticular formation. Cerebral aqueduct connects the third and the fourth ventricles. It's surrounded by the periaqueductal gray matter. And the midbrain houses nuclei of the cranial nerve 3, which is oculomotor, and 4, the trochlear. The tectum contains the foremounds, making a tectal plate. And the pair of superior colliculi control visual reflexes and tracking, and the pair of inferior colliculi control auditory reflexes. So for our midbrain here, see the anterior mid-sagittal view for our midbrain, and here's the posterior view, superior colliculus here, part of the tectum, and we have our cerebral aqueduct, cerebrospinal fluid going through. We have our reticular formation, the tegmentum here, the periaqueductal gray matter, our nucleus for oculomotor nerve, and we have our medial lemniscus here, our red nucleus, our substantia nigra, and this entire section here is a cerebral peduncle on either side there, and oculomotor nerves here. The pons is the bulging region of the anterior brainstem, includes the sensory and the motor tracts connecting the brain to the spinal cord. The middle cerebellar peduncles are the contain the transverse axons that are connecting the pons to the cerebellum, or that's what it is, I should say. The pontine respiratory center helps regulate our skeletal muscles for breathing. And the superior olivary nuclei helps with sound localization. And the cranial nerve nuclei, sensor and the motor nuclei for cranial nerve 5 and 8 to 8, 5 through 8 essentially, the trigeminal, the abducens, the facial, and the vestibular cochlear nerves. And then for the pons, see our pons section here of our brain, the pontine respiratory center here. This would be the pons. We have our superior olivary nucleus. We have our medulla oblongata here. We have our olive there, our fourth ventricle, inferior olivary nucleus, and our reticular formation. The longitudinal section there of that midbrain. And we have our fourth ventricle here, our middle cerebellar peduncle, our superior cerebellar peduncle. Then we have our trigeminal main sensory nucleus and our trigeminal motor nucleus. Here's we have reticular formation. Our medial lemniscus, our superior olivary nuclei, our trigeminal nerve here, the CN5, cranial nerve 5. And then we have our pontine respiratory center here, and the fibers of the pyramidal tract. The cross-sectional view of the pons. Like I said midbrain earlier, I meant the pons. The medulla oblongata is the inferior portion of the brainstem, continues the spinal cord inferiorly, includes the sensory and motor tracts connecting the brain to the spinal cord. The pyramid are a pair of ridges on the anterior surface that house the corticospinal tracts for the motor control. Most tract axons cross the decussation of the pyramids, so each side of the cortex controls movement on the opposite body side. The olives are bulges lateral to each pyramid. They contain the inferior olivary nucleus. They relay proprioceptive information to the cerebellum. The inferior cerebellar peduncles tracts are connecting the medulla to the cerebellum. As far as the medulla oblongata autonomic nuclei of that medulla, the cardiac center regulates heart output. The vasomotor center regulates blood vessel diameter. There's a strong influence on blood pressure with vessel constriction increasing pressure. The medullary respiratory center controls with breathing rate. Contains your dorsal and ventral respiratory groups. Communicates with the pontine respiratory center. Now there's other nuclei that are for varied functions like coughing, sneezing, vomiting, salivating, and swallowing as well. The cranial nerve nuclei of the medulla are the nuclei for the vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, the vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal nerves. The nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis receive the somatic sensory information, and they send signals through the medial lemniscus to the thalamus. So looking at our medulla oblongata and our cross-sectional view, we've got, you'll need to know these, we have for the posterior view our fourth ventricle, the nuclei of the vestibulocochlear nerve, CN8, and then we have the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve for CN12 here, and then we have the nucleus of the vagus nerve, or CN10, and then we have our inferior olivary nucleus, or the medial lemniscus, and the vagus nerve again here, CN10 here, projecting out. The olive, we have our pyramid, our hypoglossal nerve, basically, again, CN12 here. Decussation of the pyramids here. Our lateral corticospinal tract axons, spinal nerve C1, the cranial nerve 1, and then anterior corticospinal tract axons here. That's part of our spinal cord down here. And then the medulla oblongata, our lateral view here. We have the inferior olivary nucleus. We have our pyramid, cardiovascular center. We have our ventral respiratory group, our dorsal respiratory group, our nucleus cuneatus, we have our nucleus gracilis, and these are, and of course, the ventral respiratory group and the dorsal respiratory group are part of the medullary respiratory center. And of course, we have reticular formation here. So what you learn, what's the function of the substantia nigra and what disease may affect its proper working? What parts of the midbrain contain paired visual and auditory sensory nuclei? What's the general function of the pontine respiratory center of the pons? Where are the pyramids located and what's their function? And what are the main autonomic centers located in the medulla? we'll come back for the cerebellum in section 6 shortly.